Well, thanks very much for inviting me. This is a subject that is very close to the heart of, I think, all large financial firms today. The criticality of data, IT, the ability to move it around and manipulate and analyze it is something that it would be difficult to overstate. We spend, and we're one of the smaller investment banks these days, as we've tried to simplify, and we still spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and that's just what we call our change the bank IT budget, as opposed to the run the bank, which is sort of, keeping the things that are already in place going. It's also, I would, venture to say, probably the single most contentious issue at our executive board each year is the allocation of the IT investment budget. And what we focus on. So that gives you a sense of just how critical, these issues are. In terms of the things that, we deal with, I mean, the classical problem of trying to get ahead of, other people in the markets, understand what's going on, be in front of, others in terms of what it means and where the markets are going to go. Our research function is, involved in that, obviously, trying to provide insight to clients. They spend a lot of time and money on that. The person, who's the COO there was describing to me how they had, recently embarked on something where they're renting drones in certain real estate markets around the world where they don't find the data reliable so that they can get, real data on how many building projects are going on and so forth. Certainly, today, we don't just track, who downloads what reports and, so forth. If they're using it on one of our platforms, we're tracking how much time they're spending on each sentence and each part of each page so that we understand what they are interested in. So, these kinds of things, are transforming the research function within these firms significantly. The regulatory side, which I deal with a lot of the fallout from the crisis on regulation, really has turned into, a lot of data manipulation and data provision to the regulators, and then also analysis. So trade reporting, we were talking over dinner last night. The bigger firms all submit, hundreds of millions of transaction records every day to FINRA on the U.S. equity market. You may have heard about the Volcker Rule. The Volcker Rule is there to prevent proprietary trading. So the way that that's worked in practice is all the big firms are creating metrics about not just their P&L, but also their risk, how much of the trades are customer-facing, and so forth. And one of the key concepts in the rule as it's evolved is that you as a bank are allowed to hold as much inventory as you need to satisfy reasonably expected near-term demand, a term that everybody now who deals with this refers to as rent D. And there's a tremendous amount of analysis that's now needed on how do you estimate, based on past experience, what reasonably expected near-term demand is. So that's clearly an area that the regulators as well as the firms are very focused on. Conduct risk is a big issue, a lot of bad behavior in financial firms over the last decade. I don't need to go into the details of that, but all the firms are trying hard to try to root that out, prevent that, get warning signs of it. I think Peter in the next panel will talk about some of the things they're doing. We're monitoring communications extensively, trying to flag phrases and things that may be a harbinger of things they shouldn't be doing, trying to connect it to others, signals of bad behavior, or are you putting personal expenses on your corporate Amex card, and, all kinds of things that firms are now trying to do, to connect the dots on people who may be doing things that they shouldn't do. And then, of course, there's the classical risk management applications of data in terms of, what your credit risks are, your market risks are, and what your liquidity risks are. And these are increasingly a huge focus, from the regulators, not just in the way they used to be, but there's a much more, intensive focus on how it's done and making sure it's done, systematically and frankly, in a way that the regulators, want to see it done. So that, is something that also continues alongside all these other initiatives to be a big focus. Secondly, let me talk a little bit about the systemic risk agenda. I think that's one that, both from the Fed perspective and the industry, everybody is focused on. There used to be this view, at least around the time that I left the Fed, that if only we knew where all the risk was, we could predict what was going to happen with the system and whether it was too concentrated and have a problem, and so forth. I'm pretty skeptical about that. One, just the challenge of being able to really map it out, correctly, and be able to understand where all the hedges were and how people had moved different risk around, and sometimes market risk can become counterparty risk and so forth. So I think that's a very hard thing to really get ultimately, everything done on. I think the smarter versions of those proposals do tend to focus on, where the big concentrations of risk, where the big counterparty exposures, et cetera. But I think we also have to be cognizant that a lot of the risks in the crisis were either not measured properly in the first place, or they were underappreciated even if they were there, in terms of what it would mean if housing prices were to fall by 20%, or how likely that was. So I think there's a good agenda, in my view, around the kind of things that helped propagate the crisis, which to me, in a lot of ways were dynamics that were self-reinforcing in various ways. So in the crisis, you had securities that were illiquid, and then people were trying to unload them, and that made the prices fall further and the liquidity get worse, and the exposures that people had to report got more severely concerned by the counterparties to those firms, et cetera. So you had a lot of instances of this kind of self-reinforcing dynamics, which I think is something that isn't a surprise. If you go back, the last panel talked about some of the classic works in this area. I'm not even an MIT student, and I'd be remiss if we didn't mention Charles Kindleberger in that context. His book, when I was a graduate student, had a big effect on me. I think the potential for self-reinforcing feedback, particularly with liquidity risk, is an area where I think there is a lot of value from a research agenda standpoint. I think the integration, if we can get there, of market data and social data, that really brings in the psychological element of what are the things that people are talking about, how do they respond. I know Sandy's done work on that he'll talk about, but that seems to me to be an extremely promising area to focus on. So the third topic that I'll introduce and talk about a little bit, and I know that a lot of people have probably talked about it and know a lot more about it than I do, is the blockchain and the potential on transactions. There's a tremendous amount of interest in this from the industry. Part of it is they don't want to be left out of the party. They're fearful that this is going to be extremely disruptive. So DTC, which is the central clearing and settlement mechanism for stocks and bonds in the United States, they held a symposium on this within the last couple of weeks. They've made some investments there. DTC is not an organization that historically would have been known as one of the great innovators. So this is a sign that they're trying to make sure that they're not bypassed. And I think in general, the financial firms that are, involved in all these transactions, they're eager to cut their costs. They're eager to re-engineer if there's a better way to do a lot of this. But I think the history, is that the system is relatively slow to evolve, and there are some key reasons for that. One, a lot of it is, and I'll say this again, comes back to liquidity. That it's difficult, or technology is not the only, obstacle to being able to settle and, get transactions done faster. We've gone through in the United States a number of cycles of trying to reduce the settlement cycle for equities. We've got a big project now to go from T+3 to T+2, which, a number of us at DTC, at the time said, well, why not T+0? The main discussion at that point was T+2 or T+1, and the T+0 was kind of laughed out of the room. And I think it's interesting why that's the case, and it's just, some of it may be hidebound interests, but I think some of it is also, just the need to be able to position and get the liquidity that you need to be able to, set up the transactions appropriately. Another example that I'll close with, is the foreign exchange world and the Cls Bank, which I was involved in, from the regulatory side and helping to, get off the ground. And this is a bank that was created to allow payment versus payment in foreign exchange transactions. So if you settle the dollar leg, the leg on the other side, whether it's yen or sterling or what have you, will settle if and only if the other side has also settled. And that goes back to a problem, in 1973 or 4 with the Herstatt Bank, where that didn't happen and was a big issue at the time. That issue was addressed, but it's a big infrastructure to do it. And again, the challenge is not the technology so much, but again, the liquidity risk and the Fed's concerns and the other central banks' concerns that if one side fails, you need to make sure that you have the liquidity on hand to deal with it. So I think there are a lot of elements from the history that do need to be brought into the discussion as these ideas get worked into very specific and concrete proposals. My own view about an area that I would recommend that we look at seriously on the blockchain and distributed ledger is collateral and repo and rehypothecation. Collateral is rehypothecated numerous times in the financial world, in all kinds of transactions, and the ability to be able to keep track of where your collateral is and, is it doing something it's not supposed to be doing is something that I think could be a very interesting application. So I think there's a very rich agenda here from the firm's point of view that we would all like to be a part of developing. Thanks.